I tell you what,
it's not like the olden days.
I'm Rosie.
I'm Jake.
And today we're talking about Warner Brothers cartoons, which includes the short ones with Bugs Bunny and stuff, which started in the 1930s, and other cartoons spawned and or inspired by them. When we were young, sometimes we used to sit down to watch a cartoon for 5 or 10 minutes or whatever. And I don't know about you, but I always used to think, I hope it's going to be Bugs Bunny or Daffy Duck or someone, and not Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck or one of those lot.
Absolutely. I always found Disney cartoons really boring, and the characters really stupid, and the Warner Brothers ones were much more engaging.
I'm not sure if I've ever seen a Warner Brothers cartoon that was made in the 1930s or not. An interesting thing, slight tangent, that someone was telling me in the special features on my Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs DVD is that when Disney was planning to make Snow White, everyone poo-pooed him and said he would never make a success of a feature-length animation. The reason given on this documentary being that you can't sustain arsing about to music for an hour and a half, which is what Disney cartoons certainly always used to be. And I've never seen a Warner Brothers cartoon like that, and I do wonder if they ever used to do it, or if they always had some kind of storyline.
The earliest ones I've ever seen involved Bugs Bunny looking rather different from how we used to seeing him, and Elmer Fudd looking incredibly strange and sort of doughy, not really with the defined characteristic features we're used to, but nevertheless doing what they're supposed to do. So maybe they never fell into the trap that Disney did, copying the very, very oldest cartoons, like those terribly boring Betty Boop ones where they just asked about the music. They always realised if you had a plot, people would enjoy that just as much as live action, if not more so.
I do vaguely remember seeing very old Bugs Bunnies like that, but I can't remember what happened. But I don't remember being bored by them, so I guess they must have been good. The ones that we watched on that video you produced quite recently were from, the 1950s onwards, weren't they? They were mostly Bugs Bunny, and it was quite interesting because I hadn't realised quite how many Bugs Bunny cartoons involve him annoying people for no particular reason. So he's not that much of a protagonist always, is he?
Not at all.
But he is very funny, which is why children ought to like him. The earliest one we saw, which was from 1950-something, was very interesting because it was set in Mississippi, and it opened with those black slaves, picking cotton and singing merrily away, which obviously it was set before the Emancipation Proclamation, made well after it, but also before Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement and all that kind of thing, so it was okay to represent slavery in that way.
Yeah, like any piece of art, it's a very interesting snapshot of social and cultural zeitgeist of the time.
There's also a Pepe Le Pew cartoon on there, which I find very amusing. But that's quite interesting too. You couldn't make that now because it's a guy doing sexual harassment on a girl, isn't it?
That's right, and we'll discuss how that had to be flipped on its head in the 90s for a spin-off Pepe Le Pew character in terms of gender, and how today perhaps you wouldn't do it at all because it's not really very good for either gender to go and sex pest the other one. I had a phase where I was absolutely mad on Bugs Bunny, and to a lesser extent, the other Warner Brothers, Looney Tunes, Merry Melodies stuff. During that time, they had the toys in the Kinder Surprise, which really added to my rich tapestry of Warner Brothers things that I was enthused about at the time. So it must have been sort of the early 90s. And I recorded, like Rosie was mentioning, all these Bugs Bunny cartoons off the telly whenever I could. Sometimes I used to have one on after CITV at 5 o'clock. And I used to get Bugs Bunny Monthly magazine, which had comic strips about Bugs Bunny and the other Looney Tunes stars. And I got for Christmas that talking Bugs Bunny who goes, "Another day, another carrot.
A rabbit's home is his castle."
And 8 other phrases, I think. And of course, I arranged to record the compilation movies of the old Warner Brothers cartoons. The Bugs Bunny Roadrunner movie, Daffy Duck's Quackbusters, Daffy Duck's Fantasy Island, we have on tape, all from that period when I was mad on Bugs Bunny. And I'm not sure why, really, but it certainly did bring a lot of Bugs Bunny into our house, into our lives, into our video collection that we can look back at for reference quite easily, and indeed have been doing so.
You also had that Bugs Bunny t-shirt that, when you grew out of it, I used to wear it back to front under my shirt at school when it was cold.
So I did, and we still have a bowl with Bugs Bunny that you could send for from some sort of cereal. So there was quite a lot of Bugs Bunny around at the time anyway. Possibly it was because it was his 60th birthday or something like that, or coming up to. And yeah, there was Bugs Bunny juice drink, wasn't there? I've got a badge of that. So he was obviously rather marketable at the time, and I did very much buy into it. And I suppose from that my enthusiasm was rekindled for some of the other Looney Tunes characters. And, as we were saying, they are a lot better than the Disney ones. And they started making Sylvester and Tweety mysteries, didn't they, for children's telly? The CBBC got it. And I don't think we'll talk about that at length, unlike a couple of other Warner Brothers 25-minute cartoon series that we're going to talk about.
I remember watching it in a certain house where I must have been under 11, and I seem to remember I quite enjoyed it. And then within the last 12 months I was bored with nothing to do and channel hopping, and I found it on Boomerang, and I thought, I'm going to watch that, see if it's any good, and it was really boring.
I think I was always quite bored by it. One thing that did annoy me, which was inevitable, was that Sylvester and Tweety weren't being voiced by Mel Blanc anymore.
Was he dead?
And yes, his death is actually rather badly timed with this Bugs Bunny resurgence in the early 90s, because he died in 1989. So they probably would have wanted him to still be around, really, and come back and voice all these old characters with their new surge of popularity. And the last thing that Mel Blanc actually did new voices for was Daffy Duck's Quackbusters from 1988. And when we'd watched the 3 compilation films, Bugs Bunny Roadrunner movie, Fantasy Island, and Quackbusters, which were made in that order, I believe, we were saying, yes, you can hear that Mel Blanc is at his least able to recapture the old voices in Quackbusters. I mean, in Bugs Bunny Roadrunner movie, which is, 10 or 15 years older than Quackbusters, you can tell he's older and having to work at it, but he's still got it pretty much. But then, when he's doing Quackbusters and he's on his last legs, I mean, he can't do Porky Pig at all, can he?
I always noticed, even when I was very small watching that, Porky Pig's in a new bit, and then it switches to an older cartoon, and the pitch is completely different. He's much, much higher in the older cartoon, even if I didn't notice that other voices sounded a little bit different.
And even when you can see Daffy Duck is really straining to do throughout the film, because obviously there's a lot of Daffy Duck in the film. But, I mean, that'll happen as you get older, won't it? And what a talented voice actor Mel Blanc was. And as Bugs Bunny says in the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner movie, Mel Blanc had thousands of voices that was nice enough to give me one of them. And he certainly did have thousands of voices, including things like Barney Rubble and Heathcliff the Cat.
One of my favourite factoids is that Mel Blanc also voiced that cat sidekick character in Pinocchio, and they cut all his dialogue, and there's a scene where he's drunk and he hiccups. So that one hiccup is the only thing Mel Blanc ever did for Disney.
And it is the same hiccup, once you know, that you hear when Bugs Bunny is drunk or Daffy Duck is drunk or something.
That's a thing cartoon characters don't do nowadays, isn't it? Get drunk.
Certainly. But an interesting factoid that I found out when I was reading about Mel Blanc and his various voices, that was he once attributed the fact that he had smoked some horrendous number of cigarettes or cigars or mixture every day from the ages of 9 to 77, to the fact that he was able to do all these interesting, varied voices. So I don't know how true that was, but it was certainly something that he believed was a factor in his great work. I also read quite recently that Mel Blanc was signed up to do the characters, Looney Tunes, in Tiny Toon Adventures, which we'll come on to talk about soon. But then, of course, he died just before they started making it. So really, it's a great shame for this Warner Brothers resurgence that we were very much a part of, that he did pop off when he did. And nobody else can really do it. I mean, on Tiny Toon Adventures, you've got people doing the Bugs Bunny, Yosemite Sam impressions, and, you couldn't do any better trying to sound like Mel Blanc, but, they're never going to be quite the same or quite right. If you think of Kermit the Frog, Steve Whitmire, to my ears, just does the exact voice for Kermit that Jim Henson used to do. But some voices you cannot completely recapture. You can adequately recapture them with other people, I suppose, but not completely. And I believe that Mel Blanc is someone who will never be successfully copied in facsimile, which is very fitting, I think, because of all the great cartoon voices that he's done.
I do agree, Billy West does a pretty good Woody Woodpecker.
Who Mel Blanc did do at one point, actually, but he's had several voices.
Is that right? Well, they all sound pretty similar, don't they? So I guess if you're a talented voice actor, you can do Woody Woodpecker. Did Mel Blanc also voice the cat in the Pepe Le Pew cartoon, who goes, "Les mew, les purr," which I think is hilarious, because she's a French cat. Or was that a woman?
Very good question, that. I believe it was Mel Blanc or a woman from the production team. They had a sort of regular woman. I believe it was called June something. I can't remember her surname. And she definitely did Dwanny, Tweety's owner, and Witch Hazel, who pops up in a few cartoons, Warner Brothers, and possibly did some extra female voices like the cat, who's sometimes called Penelope, especially in Bugs Bunny Monthly.
I've forgotten that. Is that a French name?
Penelope, I suppose it is. Of course, it's interesting Pepe Le Pew has to be French because it's stereotypical for a sex pest, romantic sort of character, believing himself to be romantic, to be French. Of course, they don't actually have skunks in France.
Yes, although that one on the video, he's in the zoo, isn't he? So I guess maybe he was born into a French zoo. And the cat deliberately painted herself with the stripe and pretended to be a skunk and went into his enclosure in the hope of getting some food. So no wonder he thought that he was supposed to woo her.
Very understandable. Yes, he thought they'd put her in there especially for him to mate with.
On the compilation movie, there are a couple of those, or some sort of squidged together to look like they're all one, and she accidentally gets looking like a skunk, and he is pestering her when she clearly doesn't want any sex. So that was a bit different, seeing the one on your video that you've had secretly all these years. You think, well, at least there's some reason why he'd think she wants him.
Yes, normally it's an accident. The cat gets the white stripe down the back, so it was interesting to see where she put it there on purpose and accidentally attracted the attention of Pepe Le Pew.
And also, the reason I was surprised how much Bugs Bunny was annoying people, even Yosemite Sam, who's the sort of antagonist. There was no reason to go around annoying him and cutting holes in his floor and making him fall many, many feet, was there? But in the compilation, he was annoying Elmer Fudd, who was trying to kill him, and Wile E. Coyote, who was trying to eat him, and that opera singer who he'd got into a bit of a silly fight with, but wasn't no reason to go around annoying him. So I was surprised how he was just pissing people off for no reason.
I suppose in the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner movie, which we used to watch quite a lot when we were young, he is at times the champion of the earth, defending it from Marvin the Martian. And I don't know, I was going to say perhaps some of those are chosen to paint him in quite a good light, but that one where he's being the bullfighter, the bull's the enemy, I mean, that's not very ethical really, but I suppose it wouldn't have been thought about that in those days.
Even though Bugs Bunny is an animal rather than a human, I guess they were looking at it as humans versus animals, and it was okay, wasn't it, to bullfight when that was made?
Got to look at these things in context, it's true.
Speaking about Mel Blanc, Bugs Bunny was the only new voice work he did for that one, wasn't it?
Yes, that's a very good point. He was asked to do a lot more for Quackbusters. Perhaps he wasn't quite up to it.
And a little bit more in Daffy Duck's Fantasy Island as well, I seem to remember, although we hardly watched that one. It's not very good. The way it's put together doesn't really make a lot of sense. But he certainly does new voice work for Daffy and Speedy Gonzales, and I was rather surprised to see that when the two of them were off looking for treasure, Daffy, who's obviously white in the sense of being like a white person, because they all are, unless they're stereotypical like Speedy, he was making Speedy, the Hispanic, do all the digging. When was that made? 1980 something?
Yeah, something like that.
I would have thought that that wouldn't be okay, but I guess they thought it was.
He was really struggling to recapture Speedy Gonzales in that one, of course. I suppose the accent as well means there's more to do to your voice, makes it more difficult.
It was interesting to see a greater variety of Warner Brothers characters than had been in the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner movie. You had more people in it than just Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner, but it didn't have, for example, Foghorn Leghorn. Speaking of which, I was very disappointed that there weren't any cartoons with Henry Hawk, who I think is hilarious. He's a chicken hawk chick, and I was watching a cartoon, I must have just found it on Boomerang or something, because it was within living memory, and his father was going off to go fishing or something, but he was pretending he was hunting chickens and telling Henry, you can't come with me because chickens are massive and vicious with really sharp teeth and stuff. So then Henry Hawk goes off looking for chickens and says he has to kill chickens because I'm a chicken hawk, and gets involved with Foghorn Leghorn, who convinces him that the dog, that antagonist dog, is a chicken. Or does he just annoy the dog for no reason? Is the dog quite innocent? But anyway, it fits in with what his father's been saying, and I thought that was really funny. And then they're just annoying this dog together. So I was disappointed there wasn't any of that, but there was that lady chicken who tries to get a man, and her catchphrase is, yes.
I think she's called Prissy.
That's right. I'd forgotten all about her.
It was interesting when we sat and watched the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner movie, I guess about a year ago, and I think we both found the Roadrunner portion, which is the second half, basically, more hilariously amusing than the first half. Perhaps because we hadn't remembered all the cartoons in quite so much detail. But the slapstick antics of Wile E. Coyote certainly have a lot going for them.
I only quite recently realised how funny Roadrunner is, because he runs along with this gormless expression and he goes meep meep and then he runs off again. It's so random. It's really funny, but ironically, if that's the right word, Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote don't have as much plot as Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck and Tweety Pie and other people, and we were going on about how we wanted it to have plot. The plot is that Wile E. Coyote tries to catch and eat Roadrunner and he ends up getting thrown off cliffs and squashed by anvils and things, and that's all it is. But it manages to be consistently funny and just different enough each time.
Yes, extremely well judged. It's the one bit of Looney Tunes that you don't need Mel Blanc for, of course, Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. Wile E. Coyote has a voice that Mel Blanc gave him in segments with Bugs Bunny, but he never uses it for Roadrunner.
I was very surprised to see that when I was young. I never thought Wile E. Coyote talked or did anything with anybody except Roadrunner, but as I mentioned earlier, he's trying to eat Bugs Bunny. A bit I do remember is he lives in this shed or something, and he's poisoning some carrots and going on and chuckling about how clever he is, and then Bugs Bunny's moved it onto the railway line, and he's doing what he's doing, and then he hears this train whistle and turns around, there's a train coming right for him. It's very funny.
And he pulls the blind down.
That's right.
Try and stop the train. Great stuff. Very simple but effective. A lot of the Looney Tunes humour.
Just quickly speaking about Daffy Duck's Quackbusters, I always used to find that one very stimulating when I was young, because it's Daffy Duck and Porky Pig. Anyone else? I mean, Sylvester's there, isn't he, being Porky Pig's cat?
And he does new Bugs Bunny.
Yes, and Bugs Bunny, they've set themselves up as Ghostbusters. Quackbusters doesn't really make any sense, they're not busting quacks, but why quibble? And it's a compilation of all these ones with monsters and stuff, and that witch who you mentioned. But when we watched it recently, I realised it doesn't knit together seamlessly, trying to bridge all these cartoons with plot. This is our ghost busting company, and we've just got this situation to deal with, and then it goes into this older cartoon. It works a lot better, Bugs Bunny just saying things, including, you've got to hand words to this effect, you've got to hand it to Elmer Fudd, or you've got to sympathise with Elmer Fudd more than Wile E. Coyote because he doesn't want to eat us, which is absolute crap, isn't it? It's much more acceptable to hunt animals for food and sport.
I always preferred Bugs Bunny looking back on the cartoons from his retirement home in a kind of compilation, rather than trying to make a plot out of it. Do you know what it's like? It's like Chipmunks Go to the Movies, where originally Chipmunks are saying, hello, here's one of our movies, let's sit and watch it. And then later on in the series, they're trying to sort of incorporate the movies into stuff going on with the Chipmunks, like they've gone to the backyard sleepover or something. I think it's much better if we're just saying this is a retrospective and the characters are outside the universe of what we're looking on and sort of presenting it to us. Well, clearly it was part of this Warner Brothers resurgence of the sort of early 90s that Tiny Toon Adventures was devised and made, and the fact that Mel Blanc was being sought to take part in it really very much testifies to the fact that it was trying to build on the success of the old Looney Tunes characters and perhaps get them back into the limelight and celebrate their 60th birthday or whatever it was. I mean, it'd be about their 60th birthday. It says in the Tiny Toons theme tune, the teaching staff's been getting laughs since 1933. So coming up on 60 years in 1990, which is when Tiny Toon Adventures premiered. And the basic idea of Tiny Toon Adventures is that the Tiny Toons are tiny versions, if you like, or they're very much based on the Looney Tunes. And really, most Looney Tunes characters have a Tiny Toon counterpart.
Even ones that you've forgotten all about and perhaps have never even seen on the old cartoons.
Yeah, like the Dodo.
And Sniffles the Mouse.
And Beaky Buzzard, who's the inspiration behind Concord the Friendly Condor, of course, from Tiny Toon Adventures, as everybody knows.
I randomly started using his catchphrase the other day, didn't I? Yup, 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 and you were very surprised. I must have thought it was appropriate to say it.
And the Tiny Toons are learning from the Looney Tunes at Acme University how to be Warner Brothers cartoon stars, which is quite a nice way to link them, the Tiny Toons, back in with the old Looney Tunes that have obviously inspired them. I used to absolutely love Tiny Toon Adventures, I guess because I was on my Warner Brothers kick. But I did like it for its own thing as well. I did like the characters and some of the episodes they came up with. I think it'd be a good idea to talk about the characters and say who they're based on. The idea of Buster Bunny and Babs Bunny is that they were the hosts of the show, and indeed they are in most episodes. And Buster is very much based on Bugs Bunny, and I think Babs really is the only female character who's an offshot of an old male character who also has a male offshot, if you see what I mean. Babs doesn't have her own unique Looney Tunes inspired character, which everyone else really does.
There's an episode all about that, isn't there? I can't remember it too well.
It's called Fields of Honey. She finds this old Warner Brothers cartoon character called Honey something or other, but I don't think she's a rabbit or anything. Very strange.
Everyone's off with their counterpart, if that's the right word, or their original, I seem to remember. She's opening all these doors and watching things like Elmer Fudd trying to tell Elmira to kill things and Elmira wanting to cuddle them. And then she does find this character, but I can't remember anything else except, I'm your biggest fan. And this person called Honey goes, no, this is, and pulls out a giant fan. I think that's where that's from, but I don't remember the details.
Classic Warner Brothers there. I always was very interested in Buster and Babs as a couple, and I wanted to see them get together.
You shipped them.
Yes, I did. And it's one of those shows where you won't be disappointed if you ship the main ship. It's very interesting. We've been watching the Tiny Toons videos that I have. Most of them recorded off the television. There's a couple I bought from Amazon to try and kind of fill in the Buster and Babs gaps. But I was very pleased originally when it was on telly with the love-themed episode, Buster's Guide to Dating, where he does a whole section about taking Babs out on a date. And I thought, oh yes, this is furthering their relationship as well as presenting it as part of the show. And then when we get to the prom episode, that very much develops the Buster and Babs relationship. So that's quite pleasing. And then the feature length, well, it's not that long video, Tiny Toon Adventures, How I Spent My Vacation, which was actually shown on CITV in 4 separate episodes at one point. I didn't really understand why they kept referring to it as a video, but well, they do that sort of thing in the dialogue. That has Buster and Babs going off on an adventure together, have their water fight first, of course, try and wet each other, which is very sexual.
That's very Warner Brothers as well as being very sexual, because Babs is going and getting these massive, enormous quantities of water, and Buster always manages to dodge them, and she ends up flooding the whole of Acme Acres, which is where they live.
Water, more! And they end up going downriver and having various adventures, and Babs is extremely horny during that whole sequence of events. Babs in particular, and Buster's trying to play it cool.
She thinks it's time to advance their relationship, and he's not quite ready yet.
And sometimes they'll do that, Buster playing it cool and Babs overtly appearing more keen, but then bits where Babs dresses up in red lycra and shows him her absolutely massive cleavage, which she develops not that far into the show. And Buster becomes less inclined to stick up his walls when he's sexually aroused like that.
This is supposed to be a kid's show.
Yes, quite. Yes, extremely physical, their relationship, but there we go. That's because they're rabbits, I guess, or actually they're hares, aren't they? Babs describes herself as an all-American jackrabbit, which is actually a hare.
We've talked about that before, haven't we? Americans really don't know the difference.
Which is why you get in Bugs Bunny cartoons jokes about hair, like he has towels saying his and hairs, but they must actually both be his. And it's just something you have to put up with if you're English.
They kiss a couple of times, don't they? They kiss in that one called 13-something, which is on the video with the prom one, for the first time.
That's right.
And they also kiss in that Christmas one.
Which is actually the final episode, really, to all intents and purposes.
It's very good. It's a Wonderful Life parody, and it's even funnier when you've actually seen It's a Wonderful Life, which we didn't until a few years ago. Yeah,
I always remembered that after that one you mentioned, 13-something, where Babs goes off to join another show and Buster comes to get her back.
Show sort of like Dawson's Creek, although that wasn't around yet. One Tree Hill or something, I suppose.
After that, I remembered it, that they were always identified themselves as a couple when out on dates and things. And it seems that I was right about that, and the Christmas special certainly backs it up, where she's describing him as a boyfriend when she thinks Cher is trying to nick Buster off her.
Very funny, they're doing the Cher and Cher alike sketch where Cher's there and they're both dressed up and they're ice skating, and Babs has got this Cher wig on and they're singing a song about sharing, but Babs is sabotaging it because she thinks Cher's after Buster.
Which is what women do, of course, stuff like that. Jealous, catty things. Now, Babs was voiced by Tress MacNeille, but I suppose wasn't as prolific and well known in those days as she has been ever since. Done a lot of voice work for The Simpsons and Hey Arnold and many, many things.
She had done Chip and Dale before that, hadn't she, in a few things?
Oh yes, so I suppose she was in the early stages of a long and distinguished career. I mean, she's not one of these voice actors like Frank Welker where you think, oh, that's a lot of interesting, good, different voices she can do, and indeed Mel Blanc. You can always tell it's her, and she, you know, when Babs does her impression of Katharine Hepburn, it sounds exactly like Agnes Skinner from The Simpsons, but it still is always very good, very accomplished voice work from her, and I think she certainly deserves all the success that she's had.
She's got a couple of different voices, like she's got a young woman and an older woman, Agnes Skinner and Babs.
And she has a boy voice, which you can hear in various characters, like one of the bullies on The Simpsons. But yeah, certainly a very distinctive voice she has, a very recognisable one. So she's not like a really versatile voice actress, but a really good and prolific voice actress.
She's a very good singer.
And for Buster, they got Charlie Adler. And the only thing that I know for sure that he'd done before Tiny Toons was Brave Star, in which he played Tex, Hex, and Fuzz, and the Mayor, and various other characters, which we'll talk about someday. And, I mean, really, he obviously thought of it like this. He's the star of the show, the main voice that carries the show. I mean, Buster is the one who will turn up presenting the show alone if it's going to just be one of them. Babs doesn't come and present episodes without him. Then you'll find episodes like the one with all the horror stories, Elmira and her zombie pets, that Buster will present to us alone. So, in many ways, he is the main character, which makes a lot of sense, as he is the most direct offshot of Bugs Bunny, or the more direct offshot, I suppose. So, perhaps, it's understandable why Charlie Adler got in the state of mind. Perhaps he did this, I'm not sure. It's speculation that this is my show, and that's why he threw a wobbly when he wasn't offered a role in Animaniacs, which was made because of the success of Tiny Toon Adventures. It's not a spin-off from Tiny Toon Adventures exactly, but it was made because Warner Brothers had had success with this 25-minute cartoon, with various different characters doing different sketches, as it were, so they wanted to make another one. Tress MacNeille was given a part in Animaniacs, and various other voice actors from Tiny Toons, and Charlie Adler wasn't, and so he threw a wobbly, and so John Cassier voices Buster in some third season episodes, and it's not actually all that many when we sit and read about it, but actually it includes the last one, the Christmas one.
And they have a bit of a go at Charlie Adler, don't they, with him saying, Warners would never let me out of my contract, and being a bit of a diva at the stage where, like in It's a Wonderful Life, he doesn't exist anymore. I never noticed it was somebody different. I'd say he sounds exactly like Charlie Adler's Buster, except it never starts sounding a bit like Cow from Cow and Chicken, which is an incredibly weird cartoon.
So certainly more than adequate replacement there from John Cassier. The other Tiny Toons characters, there's lots of other Tiny Toons, but who cares who they are, as Plucky says.
Well, we could talk about Plucky first, or we could talk about Fifi La Fume, as we've already mentioned her, sort of.
Well, we have. Fifi La Fume is the offshot of Pepe Le Pew. She's a female skunk rather than a male skunk, but she has exactly the same character as Pepe Le Pew.
She's the horniest toon in Acme Acres.
She sure is, and she's extremely curvaceous and voluptuous and sexual.
She's quite naked, but she certainly has a bulge in the chest area.
The hips, good lord. And in the How I Spent My Vacation video, where she's going around trying to get the autograph of the film star, Johnny Pugh, who is actually a skunk, unusually, for Fifi's objects of affection, she's very lucky that she doesn't end up getting taken sexual advantage of by this older film star, because she's certainly presenting herself to him in a very sexual way. Not that I'm saying that would give him the right to sexually violate her, of course. But fortunately, all he wants her to do really is carry his stuff and be his servant and just pander to his ego. She doesn't stand for in the end, of course.
You did an impression of her just then, and her name is Fifi La Fume. Even though it's not okay for her to be a male character, it's still okay for her to be French, which is very interesting.
I don't think you get away with it nowadays, even though she is female. All this sex pestering she does, and the French stereotype wouldn't really be appropriate, would it?
Not at all. The people who she does pester, certainly in the earlier cartoons, she does believe to be skunks, of course, like Pepe Le Pew and Penelope. You tell me it happened with Verbal, the cat, and he had the skunk stripe painted on him somehow. I don't really remember that, but quite believe it.
That's a very, very early episode, possibly like the second episode of Furball and the White Line, and I suppose they did well to avoid the trap of not always doing it with Furball. It's very memorable, of course, the Fifi and Calamity Coyote and Little Beeper cartoon, because it's in the Love episode we've had on tape for so long.
They mix up the two, don't they? The Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner situation and the Pepe Le Pew situation. And Calamity Coyote gets sort of tarred and feathered. He gets all covered in black tar and white feathers stuck on him. So naturally, Fifi thinks he is a skunk and tries to have sex with him.
She really does. She calls him her reason for puberty. In her French accent.
I didn't notice that, I have to admit.
Mon raison for puberty.
Good heavens.
Very, very sexual.
She does end up getting into a ship with Hampton J. Pig, doesn't she?
Yes, which really is the classic situation of you've got 3 main boys and the 3 main girls, and the 2 left over might as well hook up together when the other 2 pairs make ships that make a certain amount of sense.
Same species ships. Buster and Babs, as we've said, have a genuine connection. And there's Plucky and Shirley MacLoon, who we'll probably talk a bit more about later. They're both ducks, so they figure they might as well. And then Fifi decides not to worry that Hampton isn't actually a skunk. And they get on with it too.
Yes, we mentioned Plucky before. He's obviously based on Daffy Duck. He was voiced by Joe Alasky, and Fifi, we should mention, was voiced by Cass Sushi, who voices in all sorts of things, as we've mentioned before. And Plucky, like Daffy Duck, is quite sort of brash and full of himself and does some very funny cartoons, and he's very keen on having this relationship with Shirley the Loon, MacLoon, who is based on Melissa Duck, who's the white duck that Daffy Duck occasionally has cartoons with, such as the Scarlet Pumpernickel and the one where she's possessed. It's all over Quackbusters. And it's very interesting, Plucky and Shirley's relationship, because he seems very keen and horny about it most of the time. She usually doesn't seem bothered. Yet when Plucky stops paying her attention, she seems to get rather, well, hang on, he's supposed to be paying attention to me and wanting me sexually. I better sort that out.
That's the sort of thing that does often happen in cartoons, and it's quite sexist, really, isn't it? Girls think they're too good for the boys, but they don't want anybody else to have them.
But you've got to ship Plucky and Shirley, really, haven't you? Like Shirley MacLaine, her namesake, Shirley's into all this new age tantric crystal sort of thing, which they take a lot of the piss out of in Tiny Toons. I mean, I suppose it was quite new and frightening idea to the audience at the time, and something we could quite reasonably make fun of and relate to why it was funny to make fun of it. Perhaps you wouldn't do that so much nowadays.
Well, taking the name MacLaine and just changing it to MacLoon, I mean, that's not very inclusive, is it?
No. But it was funny, that one you found quite recently on cable telly, and Shirley was trying to get Hampton to tap into his inner strength and let out his aura and stuff, so he could win this boxing match with Montana Max, and Hampton was saying to her, "Gosh, Shirley, that makes a lot of sense," and then he looks to the camera and makes his screwball reference. So what did he actually do?
He did the twist your finger around by your head, scramble your brain kind of gesture, didn't he?
Yes, all this new age stuff is crap, viewers, isn't it? Hampton often found himself being a victim of Plucky and his various schemes, including in that episode.
I was finding that episode really quite boring, except that bit you mentioned, which made us laugh, but also when Plucky was getting him into the boxing match with Montana Max and saying, not in so many words, Hampton can kick your ass and stuff like that. And Hampton comes along saying, "Oh, Plucky, don't do this." And Plucky goes, "You stay out of there, like it's nothing to do with Hampton," which made me laugh.
Very much like the Daffy Duck and Porky Pig relationship there, I think.
I don't know if you noticed, by the way, my Plucky impression has a slight speech impediment, as Daffy Duck calls it in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. He's doing some singing with Donald Duck, and he's going, "That's the last time I work with a duck who has a speech impediment," which is hilarious.
That's Mel Blanc coming back, isn't it?
Oh, yes, of course.
Interesting to see how well he does the voices in that if they ever show on TV again.
He has a slight sort of spit when he talks, does Plucky, and I was seeing a cartoon on Cartoonito where I was finding these recently. It was Sweetie Pie, who does a slight Tweenie impression, and he has a little bit of a speech impediment. But Elmira, who's based on Elmer Fudd, it's not okay for her to have the spare room wardrobe kind of thing, and Hampton, who was just talked about, does not have a stammer like Porky Pig, and perhaps if they'd made it 10 years earlier, which they didn't, but if they had, perhaps they would have had those speech impediments.
How interesting what is and isn't acceptable at different times, and how double and more than double standard it is.
When I was watching those episodes, I found one where Sweetie Pie, who is Sweetie Pie's offshot, was trying to eat that green bookworm character, which was interesting because normally Tweety is the victim, but Sweetie's never had Furball or Calamity Coyote or anyone after her, as far as I'm aware.
It's rather underused, Sweetie, really, isn't she?
I was very interested to see that and to hear her voice and hear that she was sounding a little bit like Tweety Pie. In all those other ones you showed me, she was not in it, or if she is, she doesn't say anything.
Yes.
But I was wondering when I was watching those if they were trying to be less kind of violent and wanting to kill each other than Looney Tunes, because I was seeing a Calamity Coyote and Little Beeper cartoon where Little Beeper was delivering pizzas and Calamity Coyote was after his pizzas. And I thought, well, doesn't he want to eat him? And I thought, why didn't he just buy a pizza? And then I thought, well, maybe he doesn't have any money. But then he was buying the Acme catapult and helicopter hat and stuff.
Yes, it's interesting. That very much attempts and I think manages to recapture the old Looney Tunes stuff.
I was saying, wasn't I, in those earlier ones particularly, they make a real effort to include one segment of 3, if they're doing it like that, which is really a lot like a Looney Tunes cartoon. And one of the ones on your video had Buster annoying Montana Max in the same sort of way Bugs Bunny would annoy Yosemite Sam, and that's something Babs never gets to do, be Bugs Bunny.
Montana Max in that one doing all the frackin' rabbit stuff like Yosemite Sam does, very clearly showing homage there. Another one on the video had Furball wandering around with his 3D glasses that work too well and make things come and hit him in the face. And that was very much reminding me of the old slapstick Looney Tunes stuff. And you might be surprised, thinking of Sylvester, that Furball doesn't really talk as such. He vocalises in the voice of Frank Welker, but he doesn't really talk like Sylvester. But apparently there are a series of old Sylvester cartoons where he does wander around silently and do stuff like that.
Furball's unlucky, it says in the theme tune. He certainly is.
He certainly is. He's always getting some sort of bad luck. And interestingly as well, Sylvester doesn't really speak when he's being Porky Pig's pet cat in Quackbusters. He doesn't fit in with everything we know about Sylvester, and he can always talk when he's Granny's pet, but there we are.
Talking about Babs, Buster, Fifi, Furball, Plucky reminds me that I've noticed how the Tiny Toons aren't realistic animal colours, which I found quite interesting. Pepe Le Pew is black and white, like a skunk ought to be. Phoebe's purple and white. Bugs Bunny's sort of grey. Buster's blue. Daffy Duck is black. Plucky's green, which I suppose bits of ducks can be green, but you don't tend to find them green all over, do you?
No.
Tweety Pie is yellow, being a canary. Sweetie Pie is pink.
Furball is blue and white rather than black and white like Sylvester.
That's right. I thought that was quite interesting. Calamity Coyote is blue, whereas Wile E. Coyote is brown. I'm not sure what colour Roadrunners are, really. They're probably not bright blue like Roadrunner.
They're not as blue as Roadrunner, but I think they look a lot more like Roadrunner than they do like Little Beaver, who's all red.
I like how Little Beaver and Calamity Coyote have sneakers, as they probably call them, or trainers, as we would call them, because they're kids. And they don't have anything else on. I just found that visually quite comedic.
So we've mentioned most of them now. Shirley is voiced by an actress called Gail Mathias in this kind of, as they call it, Valley Girl accent, which is a sort of California, whatever sort of thing. Hampton was voiced by this quite old man called Don Messick, who'd done a lot of cartoon voices. And he died before the turn of the century, but he still managed to make Hampton sound quite young, and it was very well done. Frank Welker, as I say, did Furball, and quite a lot of vocalisations for Little Beaver and anything Calamity Coyote did, and Go-Go Dodo. It seems to do a lot of things around Acme University, like Be the Clock, and he was also the kind of ruler of Wacky Land, which is next to Acme Acres.
He should already have his Toon degree, really, shouldn't he?
And that prom one, when he comes up to Mary Melody and her date and goes, "Hi, kids," and you think, oh, perhaps he's staff. then?
But he's supposed to be one of the Tiny Toons. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, I suppose that fits in with the character, really, because everything about Go-Go is wacky and doesn't make sense. You have mentioned briefly, but haven't talked about properly, Elmira, who, of course, as you say, is based on Elmer Fudd, and she is bald like Elmer Fudd, but she wears an orange wig.
And her surname is Duff, isn't it?
Indeed. And she's voiced by Cree Summer, who also did Mary Melody, and that is a voice actress you'll find in many, many things, from Inspector Gadget to Gadget Boy.
Codename Kids Next Door, as told by Ginger, Rugrats, a lot of things.
Yeah. Oh, and Sweetie was Candy Milo as the voice actress, but then you hear her being voiced by Frank Welker in our video, being Montana Max's pirate parrot. So.
It's a sort of fantasy sequence, and it's a pirate parrot voice, so that's okay.
So maybe Candy Milo wasn't in that much and didn't do that much, Sweetie. Did some vocalizations for How I Spent My Vacation, apparently, but doesn't say very much.
In that one that I mentioned, by the way, she has this catchphrase, which is lunchtime! And she's trying to eat this worm, and I was very surprised to see all this.
Underused characters, Sweetie.
So I want to talk about Elmira. One of the things that made me think, they're trying to be a bit less violent. You know, because some of them do want to eat each other. Calamity Coyote certainly does want to eat Little Beaver sometimes, and Sweetie wants to eat this bookworm. But one of the things that made me think, are they trying to tone it down, was the fact that Elmira didn't want to kill the animals like Elmer Fudd. She wanted to take them in and smother them with love.
It's quite a nice bit of irony there. Works very well.
On that video that you showed me, she was trying to get a cat of some kind, a big cat from the safari park, and she was saying, I'll just die if I don't get a kitty. And I can certainly relate to that. I've felt like that every time I've gone to get one of our cats. But what I found quite interesting in that It's a Wonderful Life one was that she seemed to be after Montana Max. And apart from Mary Melody, who is a bit more sort of mature than they are and not really in the gang, they are the only two humans, so I always used to think they probably should. They might as well have a ship. And then you showed me that one with the prom, and I found that very interesting. Montana Max rejecting Elmira and then getting rejected himself by that woman who Dizzy Devil had brought, and he's purple and Taz is brown, by the way. And Montana Max understanding how he made her feel, and I like the bit where she's crying and he's feeling bad and he gives her this dollar bill, or 10 or 20 or 100, whatever it's supposed to be, this money bill, and she says thank you and blows her nose on it because he thinks money will solve everything. Montana Max has money, is how they explain him in the theme tune, and she thinks that he's giving her real emotional support. I enjoyed that, and then they seemed to make a connection. And after that, he doesn't seem quite so keen, but that would explain why she thinks that he is her boyfriend head.
Yes, very much so. We mentioned Montana Max quite a lot now, and you can tell the sort of character he is and how they use him in the show. I was reading very recently that he was voiced by an actor called Danny Cooksey, who was the only cast member, or one who was playing a Tiny Toon, who was under 20 during the series, which I thought was quite interesting. He does sound quite genuinely young.
He's got quite a high voice. I did wonder if he might be a woman, but he's not.
But they certainly do make good use of him in a lot of episodes, being rather like Yosemite Sam and his aggressiveness and his rack-a-frackin' rabbit speech. And now that you've mentioned Dizzy Devil, we really have practically mentioned all of them. Dizzy Devil was voiced by Maurice LaMarche, who's bound to be in it somewhere. And there he is. And the other one, who I think is a bit of a later addition, is Foulmouth, who's your Foghorn Leghorn spin-off. And Foulmouth's thing is that he's a chicken and he's unpleasant and he swears, as it were, but he says "dadgum" and things because it's a children's show. And he's after Shirley in this How I Spent My Vacation video.
Maybe he figures she's the closest thing to a chicken.
Yes, that's right, they are both white birds, farmyard birds. But Shirley goes to the movies with him to shut him up, but I don't think she's that interested in him. She really is going to go off with Plucky, so Foulmouth isn't going to be very pleased about that. But there are cartoon segments with Foulmouth on the real show, but we haven't got any of them on video. But he's always worth including in the list of Tiny Toons.
We mentioned Sniffles the Mouse, who I've never seen, had a Tiny Toon called Sneezer. It was Sushi too, wasn't he? Doing her sort of small child voice. And
That's right.
He was a mouse and he sneezed. And I can't really remember anything that he ever did apart from that.
But they didn't include the character Lightning Rodriguez, who was going to be based on Speedy Gonzales, obviously, because it was going to be too offensive to Mexicans.
And other Hispanics.
So that is very interesting that they had that idea and then thought, oh no, we can't do that. I think they would think that's about a lot more ideas nowadays.
And yet it's fine to have Fifi La Fume, the French sex pest.
Double standards, triple standards, I don't know. So that really is all the main characters, and as part of my Bugs Bunny Looney Tunes kick, I found it very satisfying. As characters and cartoons themselves, I found it very satisfying. But I found it interesting when Rosie told me quite recently that she was more enthused in the 90s by Animaniacs, which is very much, as I said earlier, not a spin-off from Tiny Toons, but an offshot of Tiny Toons. One thing I didn't mention that I meant to was some of the Plucky cartoons that they did had Baby Plucky.
Oh, I enjoyed those particularly.
And we did particularly enjoy those. And Baby Plucky had to learn how to use the lavatory and wasn't very impressed by it.
Why don't go down the hole? I remember him saying when he would flush it and see the water go down.
And he put a whole load of stuff down there that shouldn't be down there, like Theodore and Ugly Fetus Baby Chipmunk. So, bit of a cross-reference to our Chipmunks podcast there. And they followed that one up where Baby Plucky was messing about with an elevator and causing havoc in this mall.
My turn to push the button.
Not your turn to push the button. And they had to voice Baby Plucky someone called Nathan Ruega, who was executive producer Tom Ruega's son, and that is huge nepotism, isn't it? But he was given a main role in Animaniacs as Skippy Squirrel, a role that he played between the ages of sort of 9 and 14 throughout the run of Animaniacs. So I can see really why Charlie Adler's so jealous that so many voice actors, including the producer's son, have such a lot of work off the back of Tiny Toons and Animaniacs, and Charlie Adler got nothing.
Before we talk in detail about Animaniacs, I'd like to mention a couple of Tiny Toons episodes I do particularly remember. Well, one really, I was telling you about it recently, that I thought was very interesting, was the one where Babs, Shirley and Fifi think that they're too mature for the boys and their class. And I remember the beginning and the end quite well. They are sneering at the boys playing a game called Will Dizzy Eat It, where they're getting him to eat all sorts of stupid things, and they end up, I can't remember what it was, some sort of massive wobbly structure, and they were getting him to eat that in a very Warner Brothers cartoon way. It's like 10 times the size of him and he eats it. And they thought this was a really immature thing to do, so they go off and they get tarted up with the Acme Little Wonder makeup kit. And I can't remember what actually happens to them, but there was quite recently when I was trying to find the episode. I couldn't find the whole thing, but I found like 30 seconds of the three of them getting dressed up, and it's incredibly sexual and suggestive. And they go off and I think they mix with some older people, and I'm not sure if they get into any danger or what happens, but they end up deciding that they need to go back to school and their contemporaries, and they kind of reject their Acme Little Wonder makeup kit and the idea that they're too mature for their age group, and Babs is going, the Acme Little Wonder makeup kit, will Dizzy eat it? And he does, and I thought that was quite good symbolically, and I've always remembered that one. And it's one of the ones where it's not 3 segments, kind of like Hampton and Montana Max have a boxing match, which I found rather boring, so I think they get into it more, they learn how to do it better as whole 20-minute episodes.
It's interesting that, isn't it? You can come in and find an episode of Tiny Toons and think, well, that was a bit of a stinker, or like the makeup one, oh, that was brilliant. And there's a lot in between, including lots of Buster Babs, Plucky and Hampton adventures, where they go off to the island and find a bird who makes X-shaped footprints, so they think it's going to be treasure, but it's her eggs and things like that.
They learn that they need to not all be jealous and turn against each other.
So there's a lot of great content in there. There's a lot of not so good content in there.
Another one I do remember, which I thought was quite fun, is where Plucky's showing off his cartoon shock takes, and he turns himself into a giant eye, and then he's stuck like that, and they have to try and get him back to normal by the time of the class photo, which I think is a very good example if you want to try and tell someone it's a sort of mix between Looney Tunes stuff and high school stuff.
It's interesting that it's quite relatable in a way. A problem at high school, a deadline, his friends are helping him out, and then in another way, it's extremely surreal because he's turned himself into a giant eye because it's a school for cartoon wild takes. It's Wild Takes Club, isn't it?
Wild Takes, I wasn't sure what they called it.
So yes, Tiny Toons at times is a very great mix of different things, and that's certainly one of them.
We have been talking about hips and breasts and things, and I was commenting quite recently that Elmira, who's a human being, is a lot less physically mature than Babs, Fifi and Shirley, which I think is quite interesting. Maybe they don't want to sexualise a human character. So that's another thing along the lines of what was acceptable at certain times.
That is extremely interesting, actually. I hadn't thought of that.
But speaking of Dizzy Devil and Taz, the Tasmanian Devil, I think is his original name. I think he used to try to eat Bugs Bunny in like the 50s or the 60s or something, did he, once or twice?
Well, I read that he's actually in 4 Looney Tunes cartoons doing things like that, so he's not a very heavily used character, rather like the Dodo that Go-Go Dodo is based on.
I think I may have seen him once in an old cartoon and sort of gone, oh, there's Taz. But where I really know him from, and you too I expect, is Taz-Mania, which was kind of like Sylvester and Tweety Mysteries or Tiny Toons or something, because it was a series of cartoons about Warner Brothers characters, and more like Tiny Toons and Animaniacs, I suppose, in that there were groups of characters who would have a segment, so there'd be 3 segments in a show, probably. I don't really remember too well, but one of the groups was Taz and his family.
His little brother was called Jake, which was rather fun.
Yes, and he had a stereotypical teenage sister called Molly, and he had 2 parents, and they all wore clothes except for him. And I can't remember very much of what they did, except one that did amuse us, where there was this naturalist making a documentary or something about them, and they'd invited her into their house, and they were talking to her and everything, and she was hiding behind the sofa filming them and stuff, which was quite amusing. But apart from that, I think it wasn't brilliant, was it?
No. The first one I ever watched had the Platypus brothers in it, who were rather unmemorable. But the ones that I think really were the best were Bull Gator and Axel, which is John Astin, good old Gomez Adams from the 60s, going around trying to get Axel to trap Taz and accidentally trapping him, Bull, instead. And you know, the sort of thing, bit of a Wile E. Coyote Roadrunner situation. Those were definitely the best ones.
They're the only ones I can really remember. I remember from the theme tune there was supposed to be people called Diggory Dingo and Wendell T. Wolfe.
Francis X. Bush lad.
I don't remember that. But wasn't there one where Taz and his family had a hotel or something, and Foghorn Leghorn was staying with them, and they were cooking his meal, and they pulled this great big piece of cooked poultry out of the oven, and he went, don't give him chicken. But obviously the writers hadn't thought that was an issue because nothing came of it.
Yeah, it was something that was well worth sitting and watching for 25 minutes before Out of Sight or something on ITV, but not something we'd got tremendously involved with and walked over hot coals for, unlike Tiny Toon Adventures.
So that's all we need to say about it, really. So now we need to talk about Animaniacs, which I was confessing I found more interesting than Tiny Toons at the time. I suspect it's our ages.
Yes, I really didn't. I really treated it as Tiny Toons' methadone.
I mean, I'd enjoyed Tiny Toons, but I don't know, I was surprised by the date of that video you showed me, actually. I didn't realise I was as young as that.
Yeah, it was all made, the Tiny Toon episodes, from sort of 1990 to 92. And then they had a couple of specials a bit later. But it was spread out a little bit more than that on ITV, I think. We didn't see it all by the end of 92. But certainly it was quite quickly, in many ways, superseded by Animaniacs in the hearts and budget of Warner Brothers.
Well, one thing I had thought was I like Tiny Toons. It is really rather similar to the Looney Tunes cartoons. I've kind of seen a lot of it before. And what I did like about Animaniacs was that it was very different. Well, not very different, but certainly not pretty much exactly the same. As you were saying, it's the same sort of thing with various characters. You get segments, and it's led by the Warner Brothers and the Warner sister.
They loved that concept, didn't they?
Yes, Yakko, Wacko, and Dot. And I remember saying to you, well, why isn't Yakko Charlie Adler? And you said that's what Charlie Adler thinks.
Yes, indeed.
I was saying, well, it's very much the sort of voice he does, but one thing I always remembered, or thought I remembered, and I had this confirmed recently, is that when the three of them, Rob Paulson is Yakko, who's also a very famous voice actor.
And he's one of the less well-used Tiny Toons voice actors that came over that Charlie Adler was jealous of. He was the voice of Foulmouth on Tiny Toons, Rob Paulson, and various other small parts.
He, Jess something, can't remember his name, who's the voice of Wacko.
Is it Harnell? It might be Jess Harnell.
Might be, mightn't it?
Yes.
And Tress MacNeille, the voice of Dot. You could always very distinctly hear each of the three individual voices when they sang together. So I always knew that, but then when we were watching it recently, I also noticed, I mean, I'm not an expert, I don't really know about music, but I did think they sounded very good, and when they were harmonising, it was what they call perfect pitch, I think. So I was saying to you, how did they get three people who sound so good together? And you said they must have tried everybody out. And I said, well, did they try Charlie Adler out and then reject him? Because he didn't quite sound perfect singing in the trio, and maybe that's it.
I think that sounds very likely.
So if they even auditioned him and then said no thank you, that would make him even crosser, wouldn't it?
Because you were saying that Buster and Babs singing didn't sound as harmonious as Yakko, Wacko, and Dot, and I can certainly see what you mean. It's a bit like the effect you get in a barbershop quartet, well, obviously there's only three of them, but like you say with Yakko, Wacko, and Dot, you can hear each of them very distinctly in the singing, and they're each taking a different pitch, as it were, and coming together and harmonising perfectly. And I was wondering whether you thought Tress MacNeille and John Cassier, as Buster and Babs, did a better job harmonising. And I think after the Christmas one we thought they did, didn't they? Well, Tress MacNeille was providing the main melody of the song, if you were, and John Cassier was sort of just doing a sort of bass line at the bottom, not really coming through.
I thought she drowned him out a bit, and he was saying they wouldn't have had much time to
Yeah.
get it together, so maybe that was the best they could do, because you do need to practice together a lot if you're going to sound good singing together, which is why siblings who can sing well sound good together. Of course, Yakko, Wacko, and Dot are siblings, but not in real life. But they managed to find people who sound like siblings. I was very impressed. And they do sing a lot, and I remembered I always used to like it when they sang. I couldn't have, at the time, explained why, but that's why they sound like the best singers ever. And if you want to hear them singing, have a look on YouTube. There are plenty of 2 or 3 minute segments of them all singing together.
Yes, it's very deliberate, isn't it? They obviously came in, found the voices to do the singing and be the characters perfectly. Deliberately did all the different song sections, which worked so well.
But what else do they do besides sing? They annoy everybody, don't they?
Yes.
Speaking of which, they have these characters who they call insane. Go-Go, Dodo is insane. Pinky and the Brain we'll talk a little bit about. Pinky is insane. And that's another thing you probably couldn't have nowadays. Say that people in these TV shows are insane and then laugh at them for being insane.
So much has changed over the past 20, 30 years. Perceptions. For better or worse, or just it has, and that's the way it goes.
And one of the characters that they had was Dr. Scratch and Sniff, who was their psychiatrist, wasn't he? And they used to annoy him with their antics. But when we were young, I think most people's favourite Warner was probably Wacko. He was certainly mine. And I never noticed that Jess, what's-his-name, was doing a Ringo Starr impression.
I read that once, and I thought, oh yes, I can see what you mean.
And I do wonder why. I mean, a lot of things that happen in these Warner Brothers cartoons. You don't need a why, it's just funny. But a Ringo Starr impression, it's the sort of thing that you would think up for a reason, isn't it? I guess they just thought it would be funny, and it kind of is. And what's quite interesting about them, if you can't visualise them, if you haven't seen them, you probably can't. They're sort of animals, mammals, black and white kind of things, but they're not anything in particular, are they?
That one with Pablo Picasso, where they very firmly tell him we're not dogs, we're not cats, we're just the Warner Brothers and the Warner System.
But they've got gloves on, haven't they? And Wacko has a hat on, and apart from that, they each have one item of a full set of clothes. Dot has a skirt, Yakko has trousers, and Wacko has a jumper, which I think is quite fun and works quite well visually. And a couple of times they would sing the intro to the segment like they sang the Pinky and the Brain tune, which was expanded and sung by different people for their spin-off, which we quite enjoyed. And the Pinky and the Brain's Christmas special is so hilarious that we had to tape it. Speaking of Pinky and the Brain, Tom Reger, I was reading, had said, no, that's rubbish, to a fan theory that when the Warners, or the guys who sing the theme tune of the spin-off, sing one is a genius, the other's insane, that Pinky is actually the genius. He said, no, that's rubbish. Did you ever wonder that? Is Pinky actually the genius and Brain the insane one?
Yes, I think I did used to wonder that, and then when I saw that it was the X-ray and Pinky had nothing in his head and Brain did, I thought, oh no, there's no more to that than meets the eye.
I had the same thought process. I thought, is this trying to be a bit clever? And I thought, no, they mean Brain's the genius and Pinky's insane. But of course they're both insane, because being a megalomaniac as Brain is, that's insane. But Warner Brothers in those days definitely seemed to take insane to mean laughing and jumping around and shouting a lot.
No. There's Pinky's catchphrase. It's very funny, striking and quirky. Mice who want to take over the world, lab mice. Brain's the one who really wants to take over the world, and Pinky just does what Brain says.
Pinky's not really bothered if they take over the world or not, is he? He just goes along for the ride, and it would always be introduced with, gee, Brain, what do you want to do tonight? The same thing we do every night, Pinky. Try to take over the world, and obviously, Brain is Maurice LaMarche. No one else can do that voice, including me, as you can tell. I remembered very well that the Warners sang their intro and which bits they sang. But Pinky and the Brain was so much enjoyed that it got its own spin-off, as I keep saying. Apart from the Christmas one, was it much good?
I don't think so. I don't think they could really sustain it for a 20-minute cartoon. Don't remember being very impressed with that. Thought they were better on Animaniacs.
Of course, they then did Pinky, Elmira and the Brain, which I do remember was rubbish. There was that one very amusing bit where for some reason the vet mustn't examine Elmira's cat, who's called Pussy Wussy. Brain saying, come, Pinky, we must stop the doctor from examining Pussy Wussy, and that made us laugh.
Good old Maurice LaMarche.
But I do remember not really enjoying Pinky, Elmira and the Brain. And after that, they sort of stopped having their 25-minute cartoons, I think, didn't they?
Yes, well, I can see why Pinky, Elmira and the Brain would stop it, kill it dead in the water.
Yes, so anyway, that was that one. There were loads, weren't there? You mentioned Slappy Squirrel. I never found Slappy Squirrel and her nephew Skippy that amusing, I don't think. And she was grumpy and he was Skippy, and young and innocent and full of beans, and I can't really remember what they used to do. They were a bit of a sort of odd couple, I suppose.
Yes, an old couple.
I did used to quite like Goodfeathers, even though I've never watched any of those mafia movies. I think that they look like the sort of thing I'd find boring. Goodfeathers is fun, and it's about Squit the pigeon trying to fit in with the Goodfeathers, this sort of mafia pigeon gang sort of thing. It's a bit weird when I try and explain it. But I do remember, I don't know if you remember this, the first segment of theirs was Squit joining the Goodfeathers.
Ah, that makes a lot of sense.
So that's why he's the one who will always break the fourth wall and talk to us and narrate, and it's all from his perspective. He's the one who is trying to fit in and the one who we want to follow and emotionally invest in. A lot of people know, I don't know if everyone knows, but Goodfellas is the one, isn't it, that starts with as far back as I can remember. I've wanted to be a gangster, so all the Goodfellas episodes start with Squid saying as far back as I can remember, and then introducing the premise of the episode. And that's quite good fun, and there's the guard pigeon, and he's not actually talking Italian, is he? He's talking nonsense.
Yes, he's supposed to be like in The Godfather, where he sort of mumbles.
Bobby, one of the pigeons, translates for him, and the other one is called Pesto, and he's the one who's sort of like Joe Pesci.
Yes, I remember Goodfeathers was in the first episode of Animaniacs I ever watched, so I always kind of looked out for it and thought it was rather good and quirky.
The one that we've got on a video, because we've got a few segments on video, is the one where they're doing this West Side Story parody. And that was what made me interested in actually watching West Side Story, the movie, which I thought was incredibly boring. What I did used to find amusing was Buttons and Mindy. I think the first one of those I ever saw was a Night of the Living Dead parody, and the beginning, their opening, it's not sung by the Warners, most of them aren't. It's a Lassie parody. Buttons is a dog and Mindy is a child. I'm not really sure if he's a boy or a girl.
They're not sure either. He's been described as both, I know, in the cartoon.
And in the opening, Buttons is like sitting in this countryside, and Mindy's voice is going, Buttons! Oh, Buttons! And then he's running, and I've seen the Lassie on YouTube to compare. It's a very funny parody of it. And then he's running towards Mindy, and Mindy's on the other side of this cliff, and he falls down. Buttons chases Mindy is how they're described in the opening, and the reason is that Mindy wanders off and gets into trouble, and this Night of the Living Dead parody, the zombies are after him, and Buttons is shutting them up in this house, and the arms are coming off the zombies when he traps them in the window, and he's freaking out and stuff, and that was very funny. It's funny when Mindy's mum comes over to say that she's going out and leaving him unattended except by the dog, and he goes, Hello, lady, it's Mom. That always used to amuse us. They sound like very simple things that perhaps aren't particularly funny, but they are these things we're describing.
The other recurring funny thing that Mindy did was randomly annoy someone each episode by going, why, and trying to get them to explain further and further something that Mindy was never actually going to understand, like children sometimes do.
Yes, the trick is just to shut up when you realise they've started it.
It's quite comforting to have these recurring things like lady and why, just to chuckle along with and enjoy each week.
Oh, I've just remembered an interesting factoid, actually. When the Warners would see someone that they found sexually appealing, they would say, Hello, nurse, which is hilarious. And I was trying to think of other characters, and I remembered they got this character whose name kind of was Hello Nurse, and she was introduced as a nurse, and it was the first time they actually said Hello Nurse to a nurse when they saw this sexy nurse. But what I read when I was reading Tom Reger saying no, there's no subtext of Piggy in the Brain, he also said that Hello Nurse was originally supposed to be a catchphrase of Buster Bunny. And I've never been able to understand it. Why would you see someone and want them and say Hello Nurse? But it makes sense that it was invented for Buster Bunny because it's like, what's up, Doc?
That is extremely interesting, actually. It makes a lot of sense once you know.
It still kind of doesn't make sense for them to say it in Animaniacs, except that it's very funny, and it fits, and it sounds right when they say it.
It's random and good.
I'm just running through the characters in my head. Runt and Rita, who are a cat, Rita, and a dog, Runt. And there are 2 Rita and Runt segments in our video. Because it's Warner Brothers, they can just be in Nazi Germany one day and in modern day New York next, and that's fine. And they're homeless, stray pets. And the Nazi Germany one, they nearly end up going to live with this guy and his daughter who are escaping from the Nazis. And he's terrible, actually, because they're looking after the daughter who's abandoned escaping from the Nazis. And they take her to this train, and he's already on it, and it's leaving. And she has to, run and catch up with the train, and the Nazis are coming and trying to capture her, going, he will never leave without his daughter. And we're like, he already is. They get left behind because Runt's been fighting the Nazi dog, and Rita's on the train, but she jumps off to be with him because they have this very close relationship, and Runt is completely stupid, and he thinks that Rita's a dog. In the other episode, they find these abandoned kittens, and it's funny because Runt thinks that he's had puppies, and he thinks that Rita's the father, as signified by him shoving a cigar in her mouth, so he thinks that they're a couple and she's a dog and she's the man, and it's all a bit weird really, but they're quite touching in some ways. They're all about sort of having grown cynical through life's bitter experience, but also having a heart of gold and helping people and other animals out and staying together. And Rita sings, is the other thing that happens. She always sings a song.
Yeah, that's the one they mention in the theme tune. Rita sings her verse, so that's kind of the USP in some ways. But as you say, there's plenty to dig deeper and find in the Rita and Runt section. One actually I did remember that aren't on any of our videos and aren't mentioned in the theme tune is the hippos.
I'd completely forgotten that.
And they're called Flavio and Juanita or something, and they sort of go around jet setting and annoy people by being selfish and annoying. I don't think they made a huge impression on any Animaniacs viewers, or certainly not us.
I do vaguely remember them now. They were sort of probably inspired by loudmouth couples who you find on your aeroplane when you're going on holiday and they annoy you.
Flavio and Marita, that's it. But not really worth mentioning, but there are two others that are worth mentioning. I used to love Chicken Boo. The whole thing is, he has quite short segments. He's a giant chicken, and he dresses up as people, and then someone notices he's a giant chicken, and he has to stop pretending to be General Beauregard or whoever, and go away, and that's the whole segment.
It's very, very funny. Someone's going to come along and be really important, and everyone's saying things like, I've heard he's got an IQ of 216, and I heard this and I heard that, and then someone goes, I heard he's a giant chicken. And then he is a giant chicken, and this little theme tune goes, you wear a disguise to look like human guys, but you're not a man, you're a chicken, but I'm not going to sing. But the really funny thing for me, anyway, is that he doesn't seem to realise what he's trying to do. He doesn't seem to make any attempt to maintain the charade. You can't imagine how he's made the decision that he's going to dress up. He doesn't in any way behave like a human. He just comes along with a costume on and he clucks and pecks and scratches, and there's no explanation.
It's like that fish in Stingray who all the underwater people think is the god of the sea, and they treat him like a god, and he turns round so they execute someone. But he's actually just a fish, and he's not doing anything apart from being a fish.
He's not even wearing a wig, but Chicken Boo is.
It's funny, because it doesn't make sense, and you can't see how it got there, and it's just random and funny.
But then one of the Chicken Boo segments was the introduction of, so like it was a spin-off of this, Katie Kaboom, who is a kind of showing up of teenage tantrums. She's a teenage girl called Katie, and she's also like the Incredible Hulk. If she gets annoyed, then she turns into a great big huge giant green monster and blows the roof off the house and stuff.
Again, like Chicken Boo, very short segments, but very funny, and always a variation on a theme, and not much of a variation. But good stuff.
The one that we've got on our video is where she has a pimple, isn't it? She's going to go out on a date and she's got like a little tiny weeny spot.
You call this nothing? She turned into the Incredible Hulk, and it's turned into a huge flopping gelatinous thing.
Yeah, and then at the end, she's back to normal. She just puts a bit of concealer on it and goes out with the guy, and he doesn't notice the house has all fallen down.
That's very good.
And the family are there, and they're like behind the sofa or something, and they don't say anything because they're recovering. And then he says to her, "Your family's nice." And all they've done is just like look over at her to see if she's ready to go out with him. And another one that I remember, which isn't on our video, is where she's wearing a midriffy top, and her stupid father's telling her she mustn't go out with her navel on display.
You would think he'd let that go, wouldn't you?
Yes, it must be terribly stuffy. What would he think if Fifi Lafume was his daughter? But anyway, the involvement with Chicken Boo, in case it's not clear, is that he was taking her to the prom or something. And it's the brother who's saying, "I heard he's a giant chicken."
And she was very annoyed when she found out he was a giant chicken, and that's how we were introduced to her.
And she went kaboom.
We also enjoyed Good Idea, Bad Idea, some of them. Playing the scales on the piano, good idea. Playing the scales on a sharp, bad idea. There are some good ones of those, there are some less good ones of those.
Talking about how things change that you are and aren't allowed to have on the television, some of them were quite ageist, weren't they? Good idea, throwing a surprise party for your father. Bad idea, throwing a surprise party for your grandfather and he drops down dead of a heart attack when you shout surprise at him.
That's hilarious, because we should just learn to laugh at things. Heart attack.
And another thing is that kid who comes out of his house and he trots down the driveway towards the camera and then he says something. He tells a random story and then he trots back inside again. Very random. I used to quite like him. There was one that goes something like, "Okay, so this is true. My friend heard that if you eat carrots and you have good eyesight, so he ate nothing but carrots and he turned orange. Okay, bye." And then he leaves.
Goes back into his house. I think he's Nathan Rega too. And one last thing to mention is a segment that was also in the first ever episode I watched. I'm not sure if you were watching it too, which is The Flame. And he was played by this living flame with a face and a voice. He was played by Nathan Rega's younger brother, who I believe was called Luke. So Tom Rega was giving all his sons early exposure to the media. There's a third youngest brother as well, who I think was called Cody, and voiced a couple of little characters on Animaniacs, like the baby bird was one of them, I think. But I enjoyed The Flame when we watched it, and there were a couple of other Flame cartoons, and it's quite interesting and educational because The Flame is lighting up bits of American history.
He's on a candle, isn't he? Someone lights him, and it's like to light a very famous diary of some kind of prisoner, wasn't there?
There is one like that.
Prisoner of war or something?
I remember the first one is the Declaration of Independence, and the flame is lit by Thomas Jefferson, and they have a little talk. It's not really clear if Thomas Jefferson understands the candle, but the candle's talking to him about the Declaration of Independence and what that means, what it is, which is quite interesting and educational. And there's one about the War of Independence. The British are coming. There's a lot of interesting American history you can learn from things like Animaniacs and indeed Tiny Toons, if you're English and you're not going to learn it at school. And I thought it was an interesting idea, the Flame, and as a character he was quite cute and engaging, and also the American history was interesting, so I do like the Flame.
And a great many of the things, by the way, that the Warners sing are edutaining, some of them about history, like Yippee-ki-yo, Keep Searching Magellan, but also geography. One of them sings a song about all the different countries. It's a song about the American states, and interesting things like that.
The census song is on our video, which is a bit of a joke, saying there are 5 senses and here are loads of other senses as well, like sense of direction.
Dollars and cents that you pay in a toll.
And indeed they are senses as well, so it's indeed edutaining.
And it starts out with sight, sound, touch, taste and smell. And there's a 6th sense too, but it's hard to explain. It's a psychic connection inside of your brain. You can understand people like Shirley MacLaine. They're keen on Shirley MacLaine, those Warner Brothers cartoon makers, and Bill Clinton too. They like ripping on him.
Very much so. Like when CBBC bought the Pinky and the Brain cartoon series, not so long ago, I suppose it's probably about 10 years ago now, and there was a ton of Bill Clinton jokes in it. People really weren't going to get it, were they, once they were sitting and watching CBBC? But we knew exactly what was going on. And they're not even Monica Lewinsky, zippers come down jokes either. They're just Bill Clinton's a bit of a twat with a saxophone, isn't he?
Darn Winder, he can't open his window on Christmas morning.
Well, hey, look at that. But there we go. As you can tell, there's a lot of Warner Brothers cartoons from various eras ingrained in our minds and souls, and some of them have now come pouring out for your enjoyment.
And didn't we make a lot of interesting comments about ideologies of different times?
Yes, we did. And really, what more could you ever ask for from a podcast, or indeed any form of artistic expression that you might find on the internet? So there is the end of our podcast on Warner Brothers animation. But do join us again next month, on the final Sunday in February, whenever that may be, for our podcast on Fantastic Max.
We hadn't particularly planned on talking about that one, had we? But then you produced those videos, and I had lots of interesting analysis, and now we need to share it with the world.
So probably that will be quite fascinating. So do join us for that. Until then,
good night out there.
Whatever you are.